You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Kevin Erdmann. He blogs about economics and finance at Idiosyncratic Whisk. Kevin, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me.
Kevin has written a ton about housing, as evidenced by the titles of his blog posts. A recent one is labeled Housing Part 239. Kevin, I've heard this series of blog posts is part of a book project. Is that correct?
Yes. In fact, at this point, we're looking, I think it may be two books that probably will be published at the same time.
It's a really interesting way of sort of publicly, sketching out ideas and getting feedback. If you sort of, rather than just writing the book and then asking for feedback afterwards, you've got sort of this dynamic process. It's very interesting, and it's interesting to read. So it's funny. It kind of happened accidentally. I hadn't planned the series of posts. I had no plan to write a book when they started, but as it developed, it did kind of end up being kind of a funny way that the whole blogosphere and everything is kind of a part of the new kind of academia and literature and it's kind of like I could be semi-anonymous and unknown and get feedback from people while the book is kind of in an unorganized way out there for everyone to see for free. Then hopefully when it gets organized and published, it'll get some more eyeballs and have benefited from the feedback. It's funny. It's what peer review was supposed to be, but now peer review is sort of a, like a victory lap when you've already, in the case of academic papers, you've done blog posts, and then you've done working papers, and then you've responded to blog posts about your working papers, and that's where the real peer review happens now. And then the journal peer review is sort of to say like, okay, here's a rubber stamp, so you can use this when you apply for tenure or whatever. Yeah. So we're going to be talking about the housing bubble of the 2000s and the post-2008 housing market. So I took my first undergraduate economics class in 2008, just as the financial crisis was getting into full swing. So there's never been a time in my economics career when people weren't talking about this whole fiasco with the housing bubble and the larger crisis that it sort of triggered. And yet, while reading your blog, I realized there's so much more I could learn about it. One thing I found interesting was your distinction between what you call closed access cities and open access cities. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think it's really probably kind of the core insight into really thinking correctly about the bubble and everything. And really, when I started looking at this, it took me a while to realize that was even an important aspect, because really I think you have to divide the country into two areas where where there are really strict limits to housing expansion. And those cities is, it's New York City, San Francisco, LA, and Boston are, and I suppose you could throw San Diego in there, really are the extent of the cities that have a real signature that's different than every other city in the country. And so what happens when you divide the country out between those cities and everywhere else, you get two totally different stories about what happened. And so what happens, for instance, when everyone kind of throws everything into, say, what they'll call the sand states or the bubble cities, and they'll throw Phoenix in there and Las Vegas and the Florida cities and inland California. You're kind of jumbling together two completely different stories, and you do regressions on that and everything else, and it throws out a bunch of answers that are really kind of a false combination of two stories. And the main difference between them, just as a first step, is the migration patterns, because we can't build houses in these in the closed access cities very well. There's a limit to who can get into those labor markets, and incomes in those cities and wages have really shot up. And it creates this kind of turnstile migration where people with high incomes or high skill sets that they can draw on those labor markets are moving in, forcing up prices in the housing market. And you get, just over the last couple decades, just millions of households from the lower income quintiles flooding out of those cities. And this really shot up during the housing bubble. Really, what the housing bubble was doing was actually facilitating movement out of those cities because you can't build houses in those cities. So when home housing starts expanded, they had to expand in other places. So the housing boom, ironically, was actually creating a depopulation in these core kind of innovative cities that can't expand. And then so Phoenix and Las Vegas and Inland California, Florida, these are the main kind of landing points for that outmigration. So I call those the contagion cities. And so you really get this mirror image. If you look at the migration patterns over that time, it's two opposite stories. There was one place people are flooding out of because costs are high, and the migration is actually runs counter to the, when prices were going up, people were actually moving away from those markets. Then you have the contagion cities where it's more of a classic, what we would consider a bubble, where you've got these people flooding in and the prices are being driven up because of the inflow of people, which is kind of what we thought was happening. But even there, I think, I think people have tended to interpret it as money flowing in, which money was flowing in. But I think people have underestimated how much of that was actual people moving in. And so they actually really weren't building too many houses either. Really, they also weren't building enough houses, but they had very generous building policies in those cities. It's just that this kind of refugee crisis of flooding out of the high-cost closed access cities overwhelmed their ability to keep up at some point. And then in those cities, you see the classic kind of boom and bust.
Yeah.
But it's all tied into this migration pattern that comes out of these closed access policies.
Yeah, it's interesting the way a lot of people talk about the housing market. It's sort of monolithic. And when they talk about a boom or a bubble, it's not always clear whether that means a boom in terms of price or quantity or some combination of the two. But it seems like it was price in the closed cities and quantity in the open cities, because that was the supply elasticity of housing in those two places, and those had very different effects.
Yeah, although I would say it was quantity of. I would say there was really never anywhere that actually had too many houses. So timing is really important here. That's another thing that people get a little sloppy with, is when things happen. And everything kind of peaked about the end of 2005, and housing starts really dropped everywhere, in the first half of 2006, and then continued to drop through the recession. And so while housing, so the classic idea of a bubble is that you overbuild, right? Then rents can't keep up, rents start to collapse because there's too many houses. But in every city, including the contagion cities, in that 2006-2007 period, rents were actually rent inflation was really high, which is not the way the people that were predicting the bust, the end of a bubble. That's not the way they would predict that a bubble would bust.
Yeah, and so these cities weren't where the bubble was busting. It was San Francisco or the places people were moving away from.
Yeah, well, I would just say there was a bust, but it was actually a bust. We cut off demand, basically. There was a lot of things going on. I think there was a change in sentiment. There was I take kind of the opposite view on monetary policy and everything. I don't think anything about the housing boom really had anything to do with too loose of a monetary policy or anything. But I think starting in 2006, we started to tighten up too much because everyone was so concerned about the housing boom. And that just all started, ratcheting. And every time, every step along the way that it got worse, we interpreted it, as it was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, aha, see, we knew this had to happen, and now it's happening. And so we should keep doing what we're doing. And I think really by late 2006, we should have actually been loosening up credit and monetary policy, because my view of it is that home prices were never really too high. I mean, you could argue they were too high for a short period in the contagion cities because of that sort of bubble, that whole context with the in-migration and everything else. But, Dallas and Omaha prices they basically reflected some sensitivity to real long-term interest rates. They weren't really outside of any long-term norms. And in the closed access cities, those were the cities where prices were very high, far above Phoenix and Las Vegas, far above Dallas and Omaha. but they were high because rents were high. And so the places where prices were the highest were actually places where the prices are justified. And we can see that now in hindsight, because today the prices in those places have performed better since the bust than they have anywhere else, basically without a functioning mortgage market to support them.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that non-functioning mortgage market. You've talked about, you wrote that liquidity is a public good, and we imposed a liquidity crisis on ourselves because we drew the wrong conclusions from the housing boom and bust. So can you elaborate on that? You know, what happened to liquidity after 2008 or 2005?
Yeah. So I think it's a series of steps, and I don't know how complicated to make it here, because it can get pretty complicated when it's partly why we're at 200 and however many blog posts on this, because you go down the rabbit hole and you find
it's a fairly technical audience, so we can get a little bit complicated, I think, as long as we're defining terms and not using too much jargon.
Well, I'm more just afraid of the number of moving parts here than I am with jargon. But I'll go ahead and kind of start at the beginning, and you can stop me if I'm pulling in too many things. Because really, what I find in that early on in that too, when housing first started to go down, and all the exotic CDO, right? The CDOs really only became really kind of shot up in quantity in late 2005, and then the vast majority of them, were happening in 2006 and 2007. So all that stuff, all those exotic securities were being developed after prices had peaked and after housing starts had started to fall. And the thing is, the reason that we were creating these exotic securities, and this is kind of accepted by everybody, is that they couldn't find new people to take mortgages, right? So they couldn't find people to take mortgages, so they would take instead of creating securities out of new mortgages, right? They made securities out of the old securities, from the old mortgages, right? So they'd packaged up all the old mortgages and made a bunch of AAA securities, and there was some lower rated stuff that was kind of at the bottom of that pack, right? And they started collecting all that up and recombining those to make new AAA securities. Well, the causal factor there, the reason they had to start doing that is because they didn't have actual mortgages to package anymore. Now, everyone looked at that at the time because we all had this sense that this was excessive, everything was out of control, prices and quantities were too high, and too many people were getting mortgages. So we all just thought, oh, well, this is the natural process of going back to normalcy. But there was never really an increase in, say, first-time home buyers had been fairly stable since the mid-90s, and prices had been, pretty level into the late 90s, even after some of the initial rises in home ownership rates. So there was really no increase in first-time home buyers, or like a marginal increase in new types of homeowners coinciding with the subprime boom and everything. But actually what started happening is by 2005, there started to be a decline in first-time home buyers and an increase in existing owners starting to sell out of the market. And also, with this out-migration from the closed access cities, there's a big part of that out-migration was existing closed access city homeowners who were tended to have high incomes. And they were basically cashing out of these, properties that were fetching high prices and moving to other parts of the country. So they were, even if they were buying a new home, they were reducing their housing expenses. They were basically making a real deduction in their housing expenditures. So we didn't notice this. When a new home buyer buys a home, they sit down and they fill out a bunch of forms, and it all gets put in the database, right? And we all dice it and chop it and look at it and decide what's happening. But we don't fill out forms when we sell a house and don't buy a new one, right? So this was all happening under the radar. So really what I think is the first part of the bust was actually all these CDO products are actually the first sign of the first sort of liquidity problems of people cashing out of the housing market and not putting that cash back into the housing market. And some of that cash ended up ironically funding CDOs, right? That we were blaming for the bubble. So I really think that was actually the early signs of the liquidity problem really go back into 2006. And then, of course, that kind of kept ratcheting up until we got to late 2007 and the subprime market crashed, and the market for those AAA securities crashed. And by then, this whole subprime market was, just dust, right? It was just gone. And again, because we interpreted this whole period as a period of excess and something that needed to be corrected, there wasn't any sort of push to sort of replace that lending, right? So that was kind of the second step of a liquidity crisis. And then, of course, the third step is in September of 2008 when there was a wide collapse in the wider financial markets. So I really kind of see three steps in terms of the initial collapse. Now, I think maybe what you're getting at is then what happens with the GSEs, with Fannie and Freddie and everything after that. Because, really just a couple weeks before, so that September 2008 Fed meeting where and the Lehman Brothers failed, all that stuff happened, TARP and everything, and AIG. Just a couple weeks before that, was when Fannie and Freddie were taken into conservatorship. And you can see just over the course of that middle part of 2008, and then after they've been taken into conservatorship, and this is after the subprime market had collapsed, and really there was a need for generous lending. And in fact, FHA and the VA FHA Ginnie Mae conduit was actually, was the one kind of conduit that was making up for all this. It's kind of a totally public conduit for mortgages. The GSEs originally were kind of trying to do the same thing and make up some of that. But because we were interpreting everything as excessive and things needed to correct, people kind of pushed back against the GSEs because they saw it, because it was this public-private partnership, they saw it as like profit-taking or being greedy and excessive and just doing more of what we've been doing. So when we brought them into conservatorship, we tightened the clamps. They tightened the lending standards, and the average FICO scores from before to after conservatorship shot up, like 40 or 50 points compared to any period earlier than that. So everyone talks about the lending standards in 2004 and 5 and 6. There's really not a lot of sign in the actual data of changing lending standards or changing any changes in the character of the people getting mortgages, the incomes of people getting mortgages, FICO scores, that sort of thing. You can't find much of a change then. Where you do see a change is in 2008, where it goes the other way. And from that point on, and we're still at this is still the case, the lending standards are much, much tighter than they ever were before. And it's after that period, it's after September 2008, when we actually see most of the collapse in credit-constrained areas. Most of the collapse in home prices in default-prone neighborhoods were after this late tightening. After all these liquidity crises have happened, this is when we actually see prices in those houses really collapse. Most of the collapse happens then. Most of the defaults happen then. So I really think even in this case, we've kind of gotten the story backwards. People tended to think that there were a bunch of defaults from people that shouldn't have had mortgages, and then that led to the price declines. Actually, the price declines had happened in 2007 and 8 to begin with, and a lot of those were actually in the higher income neighborhoods. And then we see this shift after 2008 when Fannie and Freddie are taken over, and it's after that then that, like I said, you see the defaults, then you see prices collapsing in the lower end neighborhood. So, you get these quotes from like Geithner and Paulson that talk about how taking over the GSEs was an important kind of factor in stabilizing everything. And it's interesting, if you look at the data zip code by zip code, it did stabilize the top half of the market. But because we tightened standards so much, we only stabilized half the market, and the bottom half of the market is still waiting to be supported.
Yeah, it seems so strange because interest rates since 2008 have been so low and yield curves have been pretty much flat. You'd think that it would be just really easy to get a mortgage and that there'd be lots of people getting mortgages and lots of new houses being built. But, you posted a graph recently on your blog of the U.S. single-family housing completions, and, they're nowhere near recovered, not just to their 2000s levels, but they're not even close to where they were in the 80s or the 70s. There's just been so little building in the past decade.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, you can you look at neighborhoods in the bottom having kind of in the low tier markets where you would see kind of households on the margin of that sort of renter versus homeowner choice. And there is no affordability issue for those households. The expense of a mortgage for those houses today is well below the expense of renting them. So it's not an affordability issue. It's simply that we've decided as a public policy issue that they shouldn't get a mortgage.
Yeah, that's it's strange. If the rental rate of the house is enough to cover the mortgage, then it's a profitable investment, right? Someone should just go take out that mortgage, buy that house, rent it out, and pocket the difference. But it's like you say, there's this lack of liquidity, and maybe credit constraints are stopping that from equilibrating. Is that essentially what you think is happening?
Yeah, so I think really, in a way, what's happened, I think one way you could look at it is at the bottom half of the market. We have a lot of tax benefits to homeownership, which tend to accrue to the top end of the market. But there's still a lot of benefits to ownership, and especially in the low tiers, there's a lot of agency principal agent issues just with renting, trying to make sure you have a quality renter in the house. There are a lot of benefits to getting rid of that problem by making the tenant and the owner the same person. And also because the price to rent ratios are much lower in those neighborhoods than they are at the top end of the market. I think a lot of that is because they don't capture a lot of the tax benefits. So the affordability of a house at the low end is a lot better than what we might think by looking at a typical middle or upper middle class owner occupied home. The price to rent on a home like that is going to be much higher than it is at the low tier. So they're getting a really high yield, and they're getting a large benefit from this eliminating the principal agent problem. And so it's not, in most cases, renters in low tier neighborhoods would significantly reduce their cash expenses if they could own the homes that they're in right now.
Yeah. It was interesting on your blog that a lot of people have sort of looked back on the crisis like it was inevitable. We were building up to it, and the only thing we could have done would be to delay it and thus make it worse as of 2005 and such. You see it more like it wasn't inevitable, and we all sort of panicked and enacted a bunch of bad policies, both the Fed and things like Dodd-Frank, and just sort of pulled the rug out from under the economy and destroyed the credit markets and the mortgage markets, and then we're just slowly recovering from that. Is that correct? That's your view?
Yeah, it is. And to me, it's funny that we developed the other view because we all know about London and Toronto and Sydney, right? It's an international, all the countries that are most like us are having the same problem that has to do with this kind of intersection of this new value of urban space and urban labor markets and the inability of postmodern cities to have governance that can allow some density to be built. Those are kind of the two forces of nature that have kind of run into each other to create this problem. And it's not an American problem. It's an international problem. So what's strange to me is how much of the conversation about what's happened is assumes an American exceptionalism. So you look at it, you look at American housing markets up through 2005 or 6, and especially if you separate out the closed access cities and the rest of the country. The closed access city housing markets look like UK and Canada and Australia and New Zealand. They look like the markets of all the countries that are like us. They're all having a housing crisis too. And they all have the same problem. They can't build enough houses in there. There's too many restrictions on housing expansion in their most dynamic cities. And there are some countries that didn't have a housing bubble, Germany and Japan, South Korea, And those countries' housing markets look like our open access cities. And so nothing, both, all those, and if you take the American average looks basically like the average housing market. Like if you average up the OECD countries, home prices averaged across those countries look like the average home price in the United States. So we're, up through 2006, we looked like everyone else. After 2006, we're down 20 or 30% in every category. The closed access cities are down 20 or 30% compared to London, Sydney, and Toronto. The open access cities are down 20 or 30% compared to Japan and Germany. And the American average home price is down 20 or 30% compared to the average OECD country. So what's weird is before 2005 and 6, all the debates about what happened here are about Community Reinvestment Act or the Federal Reserve Policy or the GSEs. Or banking deregulation. They're all these arguments from American exceptionalism, but there was nothing exceptional going on here until after 2006. And now, think about what was different about us after that. Well, after that, we destroyed the subprime, or let the subprime market die. We took over the GSEs, and cut lending standards. We, imposed a bunch of new banking regulations to limit lending. Everything that makes us different happened later when we actually do look different than everyone else. So again, I think we kind of have everything upside down.
Yeah. And I mean, at least with the Fed, there's this plausible mechanism that, the US dollar is so globally important and other central banks maybe try to follow Fed policy. And have a lot of U.S. dollar reserves, a lot of them. But those other, Community Reinvestment Act, that's, exclusively American and can't possibly explain Toronto or Vancouver or Sydney. And yet we see that same pattern. So that's an interesting take. And it definitely takes a lot away from the sort of destiny arguments about the financial crisis.
Yeah, and it's funny too, because if you look at the international context, you go to Australia, and we can. It's obvious, I think, I think everyone can accept that places like Vancouver and Toronto and Sydney and London, like there are limits to, there's definitely a supply limitation problem there. Even some of those cities might be kind of growing, but the fact of the matter is there's just a huge demand for living in these cities today because of just where we are technologically and economically. But the funny thing is, you go to each of those countries, and every country, the conversation is about what's wrong with our lending market. You go to Canada, what do we need to do to draw back our lenders, because our lenders are causing this housing bubble, right? You can go to Australia, or it's housing speculators, or it's foreign money pouring in, right? They all have completely different mortgage systems, right? Some of the places don't have recourse, some do. Some have, we have long-term fixed rate mortgage markets. Most countries don't have that. A bunch of them have, balloon payments or adjustable rates. They're all totally different systems. Some of them have, public systems like the FHA or something, and some of them are more privatized. But in every country, they're not arguing about how do we fix the supply problem. In every country, they argue about what's wrong with the lending system that's creating a bubble. And so they all make it like it's a Canadian exceptionalism problem in Canada. It's an Australian exceptionalism problem in Australia, right? And here there is actually a reason for the housing bubble that's drawing all these places together. And for some reason, it's the one thing we tend not to have an intuition toward thinking about.
Yeah. And one thing very refreshing on your blog is that you point out that every theory of a demand side factor pushing up or down housing prices implicitly assumes an inelastic housing supply. And so we debate all day about, that the Chinese are coming in and buying all our homes and then leaving them empty, or our lenders or our central bank are doing things to our housing market. And if we were like Tokyo and had a fairly elastic housing supply, none of that would matter, right? It's entirely a symptom. Or we now I recently saw people proposing that we we ban Airbnb because it's taking units away from long-term renters. And, that's only the case because that we need to fight so much about demand because we don't have any supply. We can't just, Airbnb can't come in and create this new short-term rental market and have a supply response where we build more units so that people can come and visit more places on vacation and get cheaper hotel fares.
Yeah. The analogy I like to use is it's like oxygen to a forest fire. So, you can legitimately, technically argue correctly that the reason we have forest fires is because there's oxygen in the air. And credit markets and money are the oxygen for economic transactions. So there's no context where you could be wrong by saying that in a sense, right? And you can even, you can even develop theories about how once the fire starts, it actually creates updrafts that draw in more oxygen, and you get these. That's like an analogy for the bubble, right? That it like feeds itself, right? And you can develop all these subtle, technically true theories about what's happening. But the fact that oxygen causes the forest fire is kind of totally beside the point if you're actually trying to stop having forest fires.
Yeah. We don't want to, or we shouldn't want to, eviscerate our credit markets just to fix our housing price issue. That has, it's akin to asphyxiating ourselves to stop forest fires.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's basically what we've been doing for a couple decades now. And, and especially since the bust. And so, so I say, it's kind of funny to me that, there are, these arguments between, there's researchers that argue that there was a push of credit, the kind of the causal force of credit was coming from the banks. Like it was a credit supply bubble that then led more people to get mortgages and price houses too high. And then there's other people that say, no, it was like a credit demand problem that people wanted to get mortgages because they were speculating on houses and too optimistic. And they all kind of just assume irrationality. Like you can do a word search in papers on both sides of that issue, and the word rent literally doesn't show up in papers. You can get stacks of papers and the word rent won't show up once. The entire cash flow that could form the basis for a rational market has been assumed away. So on the forest fire analogy, the way I say, it's kind of like they all agree, well, the cities that don't have the supply problem, there's not a problem. We can ignore those. So it's like, but these forests where we keep running around in the forest with flamethrowers, boy, that oxygen problem is just killing us in those forests.
Right.
And it's because
of course it exists everywhere.
Yeah. They've just assumed away the flamethrower that actually is starting the fire.
Yeah.
And I think this goes back to our first thing that we talked about, that because we looked at because everyone thinks of the American housing market, some of this stuff gets washed away. So if you look at the entire market, it looks like prices went way up. The national average price to rent ratio, went really high during the bubble. So when we run regressions on national numbers, it does look like rent has nothing to do with it. So partly what happened is we kind of made an error on both ends of the equation. First, people were looking at the national numbers and they said, well, it doesn't look like rent's explaining the prices. So that's when we kind of decided early on we can stop thinking about rent. This is clearly something not related to present value of future cash flows. There's something else going on. And then we skipped over the city level and we went down to the local level. And, when some people looked at the difference between low-end home price appreciation and high-end home price appreciation in certain cities, in some cities it looked like prices at the low end had gone up. And since we assumed away the rent problem, then it seemed natural to assume that was, those would be more credit constrained neighborhoods. So by kind of process of elimination, we determined that was this kind of proves the credit causation. But the thing is, between those two extremes, there's the metropolitan area level. And when you look at prices at the metropolitan level, rent explains everything. And the funny thing is, you go to the streets of San Francisco where people are marching against some new building going up in the Mission District or something. The people on the street are mad because they think it's going to make the rents go up. They think it's going to draw a bunch of high-income people that can afford those places, the new places, and that's going to make their neighborhood go upscale, right? So on the ground, they're worried about rent, and somewhere between those, marches on the ground level and the macro level economic debates, rent gets lost, and then we get to the point where in the papers we're not even talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, they're making this error, right? Nobody would do it for cars, but you think that somehow building a whole bunch of expensive cars is going to make cars more expensive, when in fact new cars have always been something that only rich people can afford, and where cheap cars come from is the rich people sell them 5-10 years down the road, and then eventually I drive it. But it's exactly the same with housing. You build more units, and sure, only rich people can afford them right now, but 10-20 years down the road, those are the ones that are being occupied by poorer, lower income people. And right now, it gets, it's like adding more chairs in musical chairs, right? You get the rich people out of the little 1-bedroom apartments and into the big 2-bedroom luxury apartments, and that leaves the 1-bedroom apartments available for the poor people. So it's just a strange situation where a fundamental misunderstanding about it's surprising how often you run into that attitude that building more units is not going to help bring down prices, when clearly all else equal it will.
Yeah, and I think this whole kind of migration pattern that's kind of been happening under our eyes, I think has a little bit to do with kind of the whole seen versus unseen aspect of that. Because when you think about what's happening in these cities and the housing markets and how people are dealing with it, at the top end of the income spectrum, households are basically they can adjust to these markets by downsizing, by reducing their amenities, getting a smaller unit. They can make adjustments to pull their housing expenses back to something close to a reasonable nominal part of their budget, right? So within the local metropolitan housing market of a closed access city, those adjustments are being made. And so in some ways, the reactions of the people that are against the new units are kind of based on their experience true, because when you do build those new units, that's the part of the city population that would like to, if prices were lowered, they would expand their real housing consumption. They would move into a larger unit. They would be actually filling the new units. What happens at the bottom half of the income distribution is they can't make that, they're to the point where they're spending 50 or 60 or 70% of their income on rent. And, that next ratchet up, you're the next household that's got to leave town, right? They're at the margin, their way of dealing with it is leaving, right? So by building new units in those cities, the part you would see is that the new units are filled by people with high incomes expanding their housing consumption. The part that you don't see is that 100,000 people didn't have to leave town that year because you built those units. So the thing that the sign that you fixed the problem was that something didn't happen, that somebody's just still living in the house they lived in last year, right? You solved the problem of them having to pick up their life and move away because of a lack of a house. And it's really hard, I think, on the ground to notice that. And it really does look like, it's all just going to the rich people.
Yeah. We, on this program before, we've talked about the way that affects the U.S. labor market, where the most productive labor markets are, in places like Silicon Valley. But if people can't afford to live there, if they can't afford the entry price of affording rent or buying a house, then they go live in, the Rust Belt or somewhere where they not only, they reduce their housing costs, but they also reduce their income a lot because, sweeping floors at some local business in Kentucky is just not as productive as sweeping floors at Google. You just, some floors are more important than others, right? And so even doing the same job, you can have a much higher marginal product. Actually, there's a headline in The Onion that I think illustrates it pretty well. It's apartment broker recommends Brooklyn residents spend no more than 150% of income on rent. It just sort of captures the feeling of the housing markets in places like Brooklyn, where it's just out of reach for so many people. I wanted to let's see, with the open access versus closed access cities, and the housing, whether it was a bubble or whether it was just supply and demand, and prices going up in response to real effects. It's interesting that Tokyo is one of these places that maps to the open access model, right? They have very elastic supply. There's another mystery in macroeconomics, which is, why doesn't Keynesian macroeconomics seem to work in Japan? Like, since the early 90s, they had a big recession. They tried to get out of it through stimulus, and it didn't work. Just wildly speculating here, but maybe a big part of cyclical policy responses to recessions is mediated through housing markets and through housing prices. And so if you have an elastic housing supply, you can't do that. It takes away a big impact of monetary policy. Plausible, do you think?
I don't know. I wouldn't want to present myself as an expert on the Japanese situation, although I think it's I think even the idea that maybe there's a problem there is a little bit could be debated, because their unemployment isn't particularly high. I think if you adjust for low population growth, their per capita economic growth isn't necessarily that bad. But there is something interesting going on there, because and I don't know which way the causality goes. Kind of like you're saying, I don't know if we have a dynamic economy that needs this new, highly valuable urban city core, to kind of set its feet down. And then that's what's created the problem. So I don't know if it's the countries that have the housing supply problem are the countries with dynamic economies, and just because of our time and place, they're all having this problem. Or if they all have a housing problem, and that's somehow affecting in the other direction the fact that these industries, want to locate in Manhattan and San Francisco and San Jose. Because the interesting thing, if you look at the general footprint of these two types of countries, kind of like how, the closed access and the open access cities have these, it's not just that the closed access cities have high home prices, but they have high incomes. They have this migration pattern. There's these sort of peculiar things that tie them together besides just the home price. And it's the same way on the countries. The countries that don't have a housing bubble tend to have a lot higher manufacturing employment than the other countries. They tend to have trade surpluses instead of trade deficits. You think of Japan and Germany. And, so we tend to blame our trade deficit on kind of leveraging our future to buy things from China. But, places like Japan and South Korea surely have much more exposure to the China trade issue than we do. And they're running surpluses. And by the way, they also didn't have a housing bubble. So there's something, I think, something pulling all these countries into two sorts of baskets of types of economies, and housing's at the center of it. Maybe it's just that I think I've kind of come down just that this was kind of an inevitable, something that had to happen just because of the kind of random marching forward of technology and culture, that we just happen to be this place where the postmodern economy requires a dense urban core, and we can't build dense urban cities anymore. We could a century ago. So what happens? It's almost like having oil, like having a natural resource, like. We have Manhattan and San Francisco because there was a time in history where you could build those, and we have a London, and we have a Paris and a Sydney. So that's the only dense urban cores we can get, the ones that we already had when you could build things without people stopping it, right? And so countries that are kind of stepping into the post-industrial economy are countries that are now experiencing this problem of not having enough dense urban cores. And so maybe it's a sign of our success that we're having that problem. Maybe Japan and Germany are not stepping into the post-industrial economy, and they're still depending on the industrial manufacturing economy. And maybe it's our success that's leading to the problem, but then we can't bear the fruits of our success because all of the new innovations and all the new income is just going to legacy real estate owners.
Yeah, that's the funny thing. It's a related question, which is, okay, so we've restricted housing supply in San Francisco and LA and New York, and that's where a lot of big productive firms are. There's a question of why are those big productive firms, setting up shop in these supply restricted cities? Why don't they all go to Houston or Atlanta or Phoenix, where they could have presumably much lower labor costs? And that's sort of a mystery. I'm not sure I've know the answer or know if anyone does.
Yeah, and the thing is that they move there, right? They kind of partly Silicon Valley was kind of there because of the things that were happening there, but firms actually move there, take the high costs to get into that network of productive, innovative workers. So I think Seattle's kind of an interesting city to watch because rents are high there. Prices are fairly high. I don't put them in the closed access category. They still build more houses than the national average, and they don't have that migration pattern. People have to downsize. People have to reduce their real housing consumption to make it fit their budget, but they can make across the income spectrum. It seems as though generally people can find a way to make it there. And I think they're starting to get some, they have the base of the Amazons and the Microsofts, and, there's a certain base of a technology sector there to draw. And I think they're going to probably get more pressure from Silicon Valley operations moving up there. And it'll be, and you can see in the governance of Seattle, this battle between closed access and open access governance. And it'll be interesting to see if they can continue to expand their housing market to allow that labor, that industry to expand there. And if if expanding their housing market helps them to avoid the signature that these other cities have developed, where working class households can't afford to live there.
Yeah, well, Seattle also it has cranked up their minimum wage, and it's soon going to rise to 15. So that's a different kind of barrier as opposed to a rent barrier. It's now a price floor on your labor. This seems to be a pattern that a lot of cities are doing a lot to keep poor people out. Although I think the people responsible for the minimum wage increases don't think that's what they're doing. Yeah.
But it is interesting. I think it is sort of a two-step problem. And really, in the book, I kind of I will probably address some of the work from like Otter and some of the recent work that they've been doing on the trade deficit and declining manufacturing employment and the lack of labor mobility. And I think really that there's two steps here. There's that core innovative pool of high skilled labor in these post industrial sectors, and they're the draw to those cities. They're the people that need to be in a dense place to get value from their skills. But, they probably only account for a quarter of the population of any of these cities. And I think kind of that's part A of the issue. And then part B of the issue is, the fact of the matter is that the post-industrial economy is kind of coming about because we don't need people to manufacture things anymore like we used to. We can manufacture a lot more stuff with a very small percentage of the population being involved in manufacturing labor. And what's interesting, when I read these papers on the problem of labor mobility and the trade, and blaming it on trade with developing economies and stuff, is everyone sees the housing problem as kind of central, right? They see the affordability problem in the closed access cities as a central problem, and they all recognize that these workers that used to be in the manufacturing sector would now be in non-tradable sectors. Like that's how they can get a job that's safe from foreign competition, is that it has to be a job that has to be close to its customer. And in fact, housing is one of those sectors, right? So, home construction. So what happens is you get this core of of households or of workers that move into the closed access cities that need them. Now, all those people, from Buffalo and Cleveland and all these other cities that would normally be switching to the non-tradable sectors, the non-tradable sectors are where the money is. You have to be where your customer is. The customers are where's the money? The money's in the closed access cities. So for every high skilled tech worker that moves to Silicon Valley, there should be a barista and a yoga instructor and a nurse and a teacher moving to town too, right? And those are the people that can't get in. So it's kind of a two-step problem, and they see this as the problem. The researchers working on this stuff see this as the problem. But to me, they all have this virus in their heads still that the housing bubble was unsustainable, that we had too many houses. And so the way they usually interpret what's happened is that, up until 2006, we kind of could mask this problem. Up until 2006, we built too many houses, and that gave these former manufacturing workers temporary jobs, but that was unsustainable, and it had to collapse. And so, my subtle tweak to that, to their reading of the problem is they've got everything right. They see the problem of labor mobility, and they see these access to these cities as an important element of that. But they have this virus in their head that they're not allowed to say that we don't have enough houses because everyone, we have this virus in our head that's telling us we had too many. And if we get that virus out of our head, then it's obvious that the problem all along has been not enough. I mean, nobody could possibly argue that there's ever been too many houses in LA or San Francisco or New York City.
Yeah. Do you have any closing thoughts, anything we haven't covered that you think is important for understanding this whole issue?
Yeah, I think we covered, it's such a broad story with fingers in everything. It's I hope it's kind of come together as a coherent structure for anybody listening. But I think the overriding theme that I would hope we eventually can take away from the entire bubble and bust and recession and everything else is that we really do, in terms of governance, access in every way is so much more important than things like affordability. That if we solve the access problem, and that means letting capital have access to urban housing markets, and it means letting marginal homeowners have access to mortgage markets, letting workers have access to labor markets. It's all about access, and really what we've been doing for a couple decades now. And we thought we were protecting people, and really what we've been doing is just cutting access to all these different forms of an economy that would naturally, access in all those areas would actually naturally lead to a convergence of incomes, of costs of living. And so I think that's the first question anyone needs to ask about policies is this improving access?
My guest today has been Kevin Erdmann. Kevin, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks. It's been great talking to you.
Before you do anything else, if you're a regular listener of this show, I want you to go to Facebook and search Economics Detective. I've created a new Facebook group where listeners can get together and discuss episodes, ask questions, suggest guests, or just discuss anything that is of common interest. I look forward to having more of a community around the show. I know that I have a lot of listeners just by volume of downloads. I know that there are discussions happening at various places spread across the internet, but there's not really any one central place where people come to comment and discuss. And so the Facebook group, it's called Economics Detective. Find it, request access, and I will allow you to join, and we'll have a good discussion. So come over to Facebook, join that group. Thank you very much.